Hey guys, so in this video, I'm going to let you know how you use your shadow functions. So what do I mean by shadow functions? The shadow functions are the ones that you don't normally think about in a Myers-Briggs. So in Myers-Briggs, they usually talk about the primary function, the secondary function, the tertiary function, and the inferior function. So the shadow functions are the rest of the functions. And Myers-Briggs doesn't really have a lot to say about what these functions do, except for the theorist, Dr. Beebe. But Socionics, on the other hand, has a lot to say about how these functions operate. So this is what this video is going to be about. This video is kind of meant to be a little bit of a part 2 for my function equilibrium video. You don't have to watch that video to understand what this video is about. So I believe that all the functions, what I mean by function equilibrium is that they all utilize the same amount of energy overall. So I don't believe that the primary function, for instance, uses more energy than the inferior function overall. And this extends down to all the functions, including the shadow functions, and all 8 cognitive functions exist in sort of equilibrium. So I'm going to talk about what these shadow functions are. So first start off with some misconceptions. So people have the misconception that your primary and secondary functions are the only strong and powerful functions there are. And the tertiary and inferior function, all the shadow functions are these weak and pitiful functions that are just hobbling about and acting really ineffective. But actually, if you look at socionics, half of the shadow functions are actually strong functions. The other half are weak functions. So I also would say that the shadow functions operate all the time. They operate just as frequently as do the primary, secondary, tertiary, inferior functions do. The primary difference, and this is where Myers-Briggs and socionics agrees, is that primary, secondary, tertiary, inferior are valued functions, and the shadow functions are unvalued functions. So what is a valued function? The valued function is something that you intrinsically endorse, something you like for its own sake. It's very intrinsically satisfying. And an unvalued function is something that you don't like for its own sake. It's not intrinsically motivating to pursue. So this is the similarity between Myers-Briggs and socionics. So what the shadow functions end up doing is basically they're used in service of the valued functions. They're used to serve the objectives of the valued functions. Okay, so I have this diagram here, which I'm holding upside down. And basically it has all the cognitive functions on here. So you see there's 8 boxes right here, each referring to a certain cognitive function. These are the names of the functions. And then every personality type has a cognitive function serving a particular role. So there's a function serving the role of the primary, there's one serving the role of the opposing or of the inferior. There's a lot of types to cover. I mean, this is 8 boxes for 16 types. So if I were to talk about every single type, I would have to spend a lifetime. So in order to make your life easier, and also my life easier, in the description, I'm writing down what role. So I'm writing down what your type is and what function belongs under which category here. So you just have to follow along in the description to see how these things relate to you, to your type. So let me start with the beginning. So, okay, this is the 4 functions that you're familiar with, and these are the shadow functions on the right. These socionics gives a name for every single function there is. This is actually not a socionics name. This is a Dr. Beebe name. The actual name in socionics for this one is called the ignoring function, which I just happened to ignore while I was creating the diagram. But yeah, so without further ado, I shall, or is it ado? I don't know how to pronounce it. But without further ado, I shall talk about the functions. So here's a primary, here's a demonstrative. This is, they're both 4D functions. So your primary function, you can figure out what your demonstrative is because it is opposite in attitude to your secondary function. So if your secondary function is extroverted intuition, your demonstrative is introverted intuition. So 4D functions are very strong, really powerful and sophisticated functions. They're superhero in strength and ability. And they're always on, meaning your type is always, always, always using this function no matter what. So we're familiar with the primary, but we're not familiar with the demonstrative. There's a difference between the two. They're both very powerful, but the difference is that the primary is in your ego block. So what that means is that it's consciously operated upon. So when you observe your primary function, you can see how you're using it. It's taking in a lot of information, but it's very consciously and deliberately working on that information and controlling and maintaining it and regulating it. The demonstrative, on the other hand, comes in with equal force, but you're not regulating it. It's an unconscious function. That means all the stuff, it just seems like this cognitive function is just automatically happening in the background of your head. So the primary function is like operating in the foreground. Your demonstrative function is operating in the background, and it's just happening and happening and happening. What's the difference? So I'll talk about how different types express the demonstrative function. So for what's a good example? So like for INFJ and ISFJ, their demonstrative function is called introvert feeling. So introvert feeling is always operating in the background for that particular type. And you could kind of pick it up. So, they prefer to use extroverted feeling, right? They prefer extroverted feeling, but their introvert feeling is very strong. So how this comes across is that when they're trying to interact with you, for instance, when they try to interact with you, they use their extroverted feeling. They're brilliant, they're lively, they're trying to engage with you, right? In a very extroverted feeling sort of way. But if you kind of observe them kind of from a distance, you could see that they have this almost like this kind of continuous sad energy about them. Like what I mean by this is that they're kind of INFJs and ISFJs are melancholic. So when you observe them, they have that kind of energy that they carry around that is melancholic. Like they have the weight of the world upon their shoulders. INFPs and ISFPs are different. We're different. We have introvert feeling as a primary function. So you could see, the introvert feeling melancholy. You can see the weight of the world upon our shoulders, but it feels different, like from the outside. Like we are consciously processing introvert feeling. So it just has a different kind of a vibe to it compared to when it's processed in the background. It feels like it's not something that we're hiding or something like that. So what's another example? Anyway, what I want to say is that I written extensively about the demonstrative function. I've written 3 articles on it. It's basically my articles about the 6 functions about the demonstrative function. What I like to tell people is that it's a power that you have that's already very strong, but you try to shortchange it. You try to shortchange it because you prefer your secondary function over your demonstrative function. So I see people do that all the time, and I kind of see differences between people of the same type who use their demonstrative function, those who try to avoid using it, and those who use it seem to, just my opinion, just have more balance and more dimension to their personality. The thing is, it's like it's a hidden secret weapon. So you have to learn how to unlock it. But once you unlock it, it's already naturally very strong to use. So yeah. So I'm gonna now move on to I'll give you another example. Another example would be an ESTP. An ESTP has demonstrative extroverted thinking, but they prefer introverted thinking. So they are actually very practical and pragmatic and know how to get things moving along efficiently. They know how things should be done. That's extroverted thinking, but they don't find this very interesting. They prefer to just plunge themselves into situations and figure things out as they go along and use their introverted thinking, which is kind of like a more experimental kind of thinking, to figure out how to do things. It's more fun for them. That's the thing. So people like the demonstrative function is not a valid function. So people might feel like it's kind of boring or kind of stifling in a way. But really, like when I tapped into my demonstrative function, I actually find it. I'm starting to find it intrinsically satisfying. So one thing that is true is that you can learn to value your unvalued functions over time to a certain extent. And yeah, it definitely makes my conversations with NI valuing types very fulfilling. So I'm going to go on to the secondary and opposing functions. So these are called 3D functions, meaning that they're strong functions. So um, the secondary function you're already familiar with. And then there's the opposing function. So they're similar in a way that they're both functions that you could turn on and off. So you use your secondary function kind of situationally when you're kind of working with people and dealing with them for the most part. It's also a valued function, so I don't believe it's just for show. So the secondary function is not just to show other people something, but also it's intrinsically rewarding in itself to partake in. Here's the opposing function. The opposing function is basically opposite in attitude to your primary function. So say your primary function is introverted feeling, your opposing function, otherwise known as the ignoring function, is called extroverted feeling. So this is something you could turn on and off. So I'll give you an example. So for like an INFP and ISFP, we have extroverted feeling as our opposing function. So we could find it a little bit irritating and annoying, but actually the secondary, actually the opposing function is a strong function. It appears weak because it's suppressed. So for the INFP and ISFP, we suppress extroverted feeling. So it's only after we feel like all the introverted feeling needs are met do we go into extroverted feeling. How this comes across is that if you look at ISFJs in particular, they're moralistic. They want have serious discussions about what is moral, and they're very morally dutiful, right? But once all those needs are met and all the introverted feelings are met, then they allow themselves to go into extroverted feeling. And when they do that, you realize that their extroverted feeling is actually not weak. So the thing about what happens is that they can be very ebullient and funny with their friends. They could be very lively with their friends. And same thing with INFPs as well. Like when we're with our friends, we can express extroverted feeling where we could be over the top with our ebullience and our, you know, playful emotionality. But when we're meeting strangers and all that, we use more introverted feeling. So this applies to other types as well. Um, what other types? So like for example, like an ESTP, they have extrovert sensing as their primary, and they have as their opposing function, they have introvert sensing. So they value extrovert sensing. So what they do is that they can be very, very active. They're here, they're on the East Coast, and they're shoveling snow and shoveling, and they don't rest. And after they shovel snow, instead of taking a break, they take a road trip across the country to go to California to cut down some trees and anger some hippies or something like that. Or they might become a hippie. I don't know. They do some sort of random activity, and then they go all the way up into Canada to do something else, and then just don't sleep, they don't rest, they just keep working. Introvert sensing is about listening to your bodily signals and knowing when to take a break. And this is something they suppress. And as a result, they can overextend and overexhaust themselves. However, it's not a weakness. And when they're around their friends, they know how to provide comfort for their friends, physical comfort for their friends. So that's an example of that. So now I'm going to talk about the tertiary function and the role function. So tertiary and role function are called two-dimensional functions. Two-dimensional functions are weak functions. And they're kind of similar in a way. So what I mean by that is they're weak functions, but they're not as weak as the inferior and the polar functions. So as a result, since it's not as weak, people try very, very hard on these functions. They try really hard to develop these functions. Before, I kind of put the tertiary function in kind of a negative light in my video about the hidden agenda of each type. But I think there's a positive aspect to it as well. It's because it's a weaker point. It has, but the benefit is that it has kind of a, like when people engage in their tertiary function, it has a fresher quality to it, has a playful, creative quality to it, like that of a child. And I think when people express their third function, you know, I find it endearing. Like especially like the good examples, the extra feeling of ESTPs and ENTPs. They're both like really prankster types, right? They're going around causing quite a mess in the world just through their playful antics. But they're also drawn to extra feelings, so they don't really necessarily go too far in that direction because part of them really strongly just wants everyone to like them, to have a sense of camaraderie with everybody. It has a different quality to it. It almost has a kind of a teddy bear quality to it. The extra feeling has a teddy bear quality to it once in the tertiary position. So it has its own advantages. So the role function is very similar. The only difference is that it's unvalued. So you can see that the opposing function kind of acts like the auxiliary function, except it's unvalued. So the role function acts like the tertiary function, except it's unvalued. So the role function is also a function you really try to develop. And I think out of all the functions, this is the function you could really feel the progress of. Like you really could hone in on it and try to really make it stronger and stronger over time. The inferior function is too weak for that to happen. And the tertiary function, the third function, the hidden agenda function, that function is actually unconscious. It's unconscious, so it's kind of a function that kind of just happens to you. Whereas the role function is actually a conscious function, so your mind can consciously regulate and deliberately work on that function. So that's why out of all functions, you can feel the progress. And it can really aid you. So when people like work on their role function, it could really benefit because it really balances out your primary function. So let me see if I could give an example. I am an INFP. I have introvert thinking as a role function. So the role function is called a role function because we could almost put it on like a mask. So we put it on as a mask and we wear it in order to find a way to engage with other people. So we believe that in order to work, in order to present our ideas to the world, we have to use the role function. We have to put it on and be able to engage in it so people could respect our work. So it's not intrinsic. It's not intrinsic like the tertiary function where we find it satisfying in ourselves to partake in. We're doing it in order to kind of work in society. But just like, as I mentioned, the unvalued function, for all the unvalued functions, we learn to value them over time. And I do see people do that with their role function. But I'll get to my example of the INFP and introverted thinking as a role function. So what does that mean? So you could see me use it all the time in these videos. I take the time to carefully try to explain things within a systematic framework. So that is my introverted thinking role. I don't actually believe that things could be systematized, like a TI valuing type. But I choose to do it because I want to be able to present my work. I'm ultimately an introverted feeling valuing type, so I have more very unsystematic, organic way of kind of figuring things out through my introverted feeling. But I try to systematize it using introverted thinking. But I ultimately don't believe everything to be systematized. So when you look at an INFP, uh, they may be able to explain to you why, how the system works and why it works and all that. But then if you keep pressing further and further, then we'll give up on that, and then we'll start to tell you about our ethical motivations for believing whatever, right? And we're just building an introverted thinking framework around our belief. So that's an example of how the role plays out. Um, so finally, I'm going to talk about let's see, I want to talk about the inferior and polar function. So the inferior and polar function are called 1D functions, which means that they're very weak. So the difference is that one is valued, the other one's unvalued. So the thing is, they both have similar quality in that they take on extremes. They look like it's either like looks like it's completely absent, or when it comes on, it's really, really powerful. So like for the inferior function, you know that people are usually really weak at it, but in the grip, it could come on really strongly, right? It could come on really strongly and powerfully, and suddenly you engage in it very powerfully, right? The difference is that the inferior function is actually unconscious, and that's the interesting thing. It's like when you're in the grip, it just seems like the inferior function just happens to you. The polar function, on the other hand, it's the same thing. It takes extremes. It either seems really absent or comes on very strongly. However, it's something that you consciously process. Um, I'll give you an example of how it's used. So, for example, for ESTP, for example, they have introverted feeling as a polar function. So people may accuse them of lacking introverted feeling, of not knowing what their sentiments are, or their personal values are. But actually, what's really interesting aspect of the ESTP character is that even though they're realists, they seem to have a very strong subjective point of view. They look at things really, really subjectively, and they have very, very very, very strong morals about things. Like this is what's right, this is what's wrong. So introvert feeling just happens to take on extreme forms, and this actually kind of goes along with my belief that the inferior and polar function are actually not very weak. They're very weak in a certain way, as socionics describes it, but it's also very strong in itself. Um, it, it's very powerful when the polar function, when an inferior function expresses themselves. And people may think, oh, that's a weak expression of a piece. That's not how you healthily operate your the function, right? So when an ESTP expresses introverted feeling, people would say that's completely out of proportion of how sophisticated introverted feeling would operate. However, I actually think that's the advantage of it. I think that, yeah, it's extreme, but extreme according to whose perspective? According to society's perspective. But on the other hand, because it's so powerful, it could take on almost heroic qualities. So like an ESTP could be heroic because they're with extrovert sensing, they're really brave, right? They could be really brave, and an introvert feeling, when it comes on, it's so powerful. So they might do something really courageous, ethically courageous, for instance. And INFPs are actually kind of similar in that regards, in that INFPs are extrovert sensing polar. So what that means is that INFPs have a hard time pushing people to do things. We have a hard time forcing or pushing people or understanding power play, right? So, however, when extra sensing comes on, it comes on strongly. Then suddenly the INFP is suddenly really, really pushy, really, really forceful. Another example of how it comes on strongly is that INFPs, for the sake of their morals, they're willing to go to the executioner's block. So I fantasize about this, and I think other INFPs do. So don't think this is weird, but like for the sake of our morals, we're willing to die. You could torture us. You could cut off our limbs and our ear. We'll never budge from our morals. We'll never give in. So this is the extreme form of extrovert sensing. So I'm saying in a way it's very effective. It's very powerful. In a way it's strong. In a way it's strong for its own sense. When under extreme circumstances, your polar function is stronger than anybody else's, than how anybody else would express that function. So that's just a perspective I have. I actually believe that there's almost like an equilibrium between all the functions, and they're actually all balanced in a way because of this aspect. So maybe I'll end with a couple of other examples. Okay, so just to go through the list, so like I'll give you another example of opposing functions. So an ISFJ, for example, is extrovert sensing opposing. So they prefer introvert sensing. They don't like aggression. They don't like aggression or power play and all that. But another aspect of the opposing functions is something that we could observe because we're actually strong at it. So I know of this ISFJ who's very good at noticing power play and competition between people, and he even notices when I am being competitive. But the thing is, I'm extrovert sensing polar, so I'm not even aware when I'm doing it. Whereas he is aware, he could see this kind of aspect. And one other example. So the final thing is that to kind of talk about the equilibrium bit, you can see that basically the shadow functions have this use the same energy as the valued functions. As I said, the primary is kind of like a demonstrative in a way. The opposing is kind of like the secondary in a kind of way. The tertiary is kind of like role. The polar is kind of like the inferior. The way they utilize their energy is similar. So so they use the same exact amount of energy in a way. They're expressed differently. They're different in terms of all these functions are different in terms of whether they're conscious and unconscious. There's also other categories in socionics, like whether there's a bold, there's functions that are bold and some that are cautious. This is something I want to talk about. What I mean by that, some functions are expressed very confidently, whether they're really strong or not. For example, the hidden agenda is such an example of a function where it's just weak but it's expressed boldly. So yeah, so that's basically it.